Hello, and welcome to the Anarchist Book Club with Danny Evans and me, Jim Yeoman. In this episode, we were delighted to be joined by Professor Kathy Ferguson of the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa. Kathy's research interests include feminist theory and anarchism. We asked Kathy to join us to discuss her fascinating work on anarchist printing over the turn of the 20th century. Along the way, we discussed the formative role that creating print had in anarchist communities, the value of considering the materiality of radical politics, and reflect on the relationship between media and movements in the current context. Hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the podcast, Kathy Ferguson. Thanks very much for coming on, for joining us all the way from Hawaii. Very jealous hearing about how nice and warm it is there. Today we're going to be talking about anarchist printing and publishing, a subject very close to my heart. A lot of our thoughts have come from your article, Anarchist Printers and Presses, Material Circuits of Politics, which was published in Political Theory in 2014. And some of those ideas that are in that article are going to feed into your forthcoming book, Anarchist Letters. So to start us off, could you give us a brief sense of what that book is going to be about?
Thank you, James, and thank you very much for inviting me onto your podcast. The title is a bit of a play on the many meanings of the word letter, that it means both a letter of the alphabet, of course, and in this context, it refers to the printers, what are called sorts, the little blocks of print, usually wood or lead, that have a letter or a punctuation mark or some other bit that needs to be in a text. So there's printer's letters. Then there's epistolary. There's the letters that people write back and forth to each other. And then there's letters as in arts and letters, meaning a kind of learning. So what I'm trying to do is to show that it's not just sort of coincidental that letters can mean all those things, that those are wound together, those meanings are wound together, and that the interaction among those three things, the printer's sort, the correspondence, and the learnedness, that the interaction among those generates a kind of political energy. And it's linguistic or symbolic, it's meaning, it's about what people, it's about the message, but it's also about the medium. It's about the press itself and the sorts and the ink and the noise and the smell and the way your body has to move to print. And that there's a political assemblage of components there that generate a kind of political, sometimes I think of it as a political glue or a political fire, really, energy producing relationship that helped the anarchist movement to do what it did for as long as it did. And I'm talking about the classical period of anarchism, essentially from the Paris Commune to the Spanish Revolution. So roughly 1870 to almost 1940.
So this is a fascinating focus, Kathy, and I suppose it's quite novel as well in the sense of going behind the scenes of the anarchist text that we're all, I suppose, more or less familiar with. So what is it that drew you to this particular aspect of anarchist history?
Well, the first thing that drew me was just noticing all the printers. I wrote a book on Emma Goldman, that was published in 2011. It's called Emma Goldman, Political Thinking in the Streets. And I didn't want it to be one more summary of what Emma Goldman said, although that's important, but I wanted it to be in the context of the larger anarchist movement that she was a part of. So I tried to read as widely as I could about the movement, and I just kept running into printers. And, you see one and you see two, and then you see about the 10th one and you think, wow, how come there's so many printers? So I started keeping lists, and I'm up to over 150 people that were identified by themselves or someone else, usually in correspondence. Sometimes their name appears at the end of a journal because for a while in England, the printer had to be named on the publication. And that curiosity of an incipient pattern that was rising up out of the material that I hadn't expected, but it demanded to be noticed. So that's sort of what started me. And then what's kind of kept me going, what made it not just idiosyncratic, but politically interesting, is that I really want to write about anarchism as a movement. I want to certainly the ideas matter, and that's like the whole point of that third letter. The learnedness of anarchism is to explore how different ways, different genres of writing that I find in anarchist journals, different ways of putting out the idea, communicating with an audience. So it's not that I'm detracting from that, but that alone is kind of abstract. And frankly, it's been done a lot. Like we got a lot of summaries of what Kropotkin said. We got a lot of those. And so we've got the big ideas, and then we've got some biographies, which are also extremely important. I make use of them all the time, but biographies tend by definition to pull one person out of their context and lionize them a bit, right? They're the foreground, the movement's the background. I want the movement to be the foreground. And it seemed to me that what printers were doing and the role of printers and presses in publications in the movement was an important part of that, making it visible as a movement.
That's fascinating, and it's one of several points that I picked up in your article and book outline that you sent us. There's a number of remarkably similar points that you make to things that I find attractive and interesting about anarchist print. This idea of wanting to study the movement, and that doesn't come at the expense of ideas, but actually, you make this explicit point, which echoes something, again, that I've written, this desire to look into how anarchist movements functioned and seeing print as the mechanism really that allows that to happen. And again, another point that you make that echoes very, very clearly with some of my thoughts is this scant historical interest in this material reality of anarchist printing. We all know about the words on the page, and as you say, they've dissected and studied kind of historically, but much less so the actual paper itself and the people who made it. And one idea that I suggested in my own work is that perhaps this is because printing isn't novel at this point at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. There are lots of studies of radical print culture in the 17th and 18th centuries, lots of works on, say, the English Civil War. And also, there's a lot of contemporary interest in media and how media can form and structure movements. But we find it less in this big period in between when printing, when letterpress were there. And I wondered, if that was something that you felt, or if there were other reasons why this has been somewhat neglected.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not really sure. I guess I think there's a few reasons that would contribute to it, and one is that I think there's a tendency, at least in scholarship, to really be drawn to the content and not the form. And okay, that's an overgeneralization too. Content and form are always related, but still there's an emphasis that can be different. And I'm trying to shift a little bit more to the form without leaving out the content. Probably you're no doubt right that print was old news by the time the anarchists were using it, right? And Gutenberg had done his thing much earlier. But also, I wonder if maybe the study of print culture was a little bit skewed toward reception by, well, like, for example, in Imagined Communities, where Benedict Anderson has this wonderful account of how we read privately in the lair of our skulls, but yet we're all doing it together. We're all reading the New York Times at the same time. And so it creates a community of reception. And I don't disagree with that. I think it's a brilliant book, but I also think that it changes when you look at anarchism because it was also a community of production, that a lot of people were involved in the making of journals in the U.S. and England. And I understand that it was different in Spain. That was one of the things I was really interested in reading your book. But in the U.S. and England, it appears to me that the anarchists tended to have their own printers. The printers were anarchists. They were part of the movement. And sometimes they were people who'd gone through the sort of trade process. They had done their 7 years as an apprentice. They had done their time as a tramp printer, which was a kind of like almost like a second apprenticeship. And so they were professionals. And Joseph Ishel in the U.S. was like that. Tom Keel in England. There were a number of those. But there were also all kinds of people who weren't professionally trained printers. They picked it up because they were part of a group that was putting out a journal, and either they had one printer who needed help, or their printer left, or they didn't have a printer, but they managed to cobble together some type and borrow a press. For example, that's how Rudolf Rocker got into printing. He was a bookbinder by trade, which is part of the printing process, but it's not the same as setting type. And he was a German anarchist who spent a lot of time in England and became a leader of the Yiddish language movement in the East End of London. And Rocker learned to set type by kind of watching the printer. And, it's not an easy process. That, learning how to do it, you got to spend a lot of time watching and practicing to get any good at it at all. So he would be an example of that second route, which I think was also very common, where people they'd be hanging out at the shop where the thing was being printed, and so in addition to collating it and selling it on the street, they'd have a hand at some aspect of setting the type or running the press. And gradually they'd do it again, and they'd do it again. And that repetition of that material, physical activity in common with others, I think that's different, and that's politically even more powerful than, or at least powerful differently than, what Anderson described as the kind of being the passive recipient of the production.
I think that you're right to draw attention to the politics of that focus, but I also think it's historically very interesting as well as a method. I think that it's very exciting in the sense of bringing us closer to the movement, as opposed to, as you say, biographies of individuals. And I think this shift in focus that you're talking about, from reception to production, from biography of individuals to movement, is really exciting. So perhaps following your own methodology, could you perhaps give us a sort of peek behind the scenes at this experience of trying to shift this focus in terms of your approach and research? Because although it seems like it's very exciting, it seems very admirable and potentially very fruitful, but it also seems like it's very difficult. There's a reason why people tend to focus on individuals, because they've left a much larger documentary trace, and it's much easier to get close to them than it is to a movement that's often built on anonymous labor. So you mentioned having discovered over 150 printers already, and that's just in the Anglophone world, am I right? So it's just in UK and the United States?
Correct, just UK and the United States.
How has this process of research been for you? It sounds really exciting, but at the same time potentially quite frustrating, and necessarily quite patient labor.
Well, yes, it's all those things. You basically have to go to an archive and give yourself a lot of time, because you don't know, like any archival work, you don't know what you're going to find. You have to be receptive to it, but of course you need some idea of what you're looking for, or you'll never come out. And I didn't even know that's what I was looking for at first, but I started with it. Anarchists wrote a lot of letters, and for a long time I thought Goldman was kind of an exception. She wrote over 200,000 letters in her lifetime, according to her first biographer, Richard Drennan, and his partner, Anna Marie Drennan. 200,000 letters, that's a lot of letters. But it turns out that it was a difference of degree, but it certainly wasn't a difference of kind. That Joseph Ishel, who's one of the people I have come to think of as my printer, he was a Romanian printer who moved to the United States in the early 20th century and became known as the anarchist printer, even though there were hundreds of anarchist printers, because he was considered such a master of his craft that he became known outside the political world of anarchism. He became recognized by the fine print, fine book professional crowd. He had several exhibits at universities. In fact, he was the printer in residence at the University of Florida for a while. So that was an interesting crossover from the political milieu of anarchism to it's not apolitical, but it's professional world of fine print. So he has over 40 boxes of correspondence at Harvard. And then if you go to the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, you'll find many, 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 many boxes of correspondence that he sent to other people. Harvard has stuff he received, but all those letters that he sent out are in various archives. And so you just go to archives and you just settle in and take lots of notes and just wait for the pattern to emerge. It's, like a big Rorschach test. So I started noticing things like how correspondence between printers was formative of them. And sometimes they talk about printing, and that's wonderful when you find printers who actually talk about printing. They all talk about anarchism, but sometimes they talk about printing. And then it's great because, like, there's this guy, Edward Fulton. He was a printer in Kansas, Clinton Falls, Kansas. And he had his own series of little journals that he managed to do while he made his living at the trade of printing. And he has these wonderful letters where he says to say Joseph, he's writing to Joe Labadie, who was another anarchist printer in Detroit. And Ed would say to Joe, please excuse the mistakes in the pamphlet I just sent you. My kids helped me print it. One of them's 8. And, they make a lot of mistakes, but, they're learning. And it's quite charming to kind of reach a little bit into the role that, like, they have their presses in their living rooms, their kids are right there printing with them. Their hands are stained with ink. Their bodies are marked and their families are marked by the presence of the press. The press is in some way what Bruno Latour and Jane Bennett, the 2 political philosophers, call an actant. Not fully an agent. It's not like the press is a person. I'm not trying to anthropomorphize the press, but they're an agent in the sense that they can act and be acted on. And so following that trail, finding those moments where a printer said, well, the press did a great job today, but I sucked. Or I don't know why my press won't help me out here. I'm just going to put it away and come back tomorrow. Where they kind of talk about the press almost like a colleague. Interestingly, often the enemies of anarchism will talk about the press as though it were an anarchist. For example, in England during World War I, the journal Freedom, probably one of the most important anarchist journals in the world, was raided 4 times by the police. And they would arrest the printers and they would arrest the editor, but they would, in a sense, arrest the press. They would confiscate the press and the type, and they would take it to jail. Now, it wasn't against the law to own a press or a case of type. So what exactly were they enforcing there? Why didn't they just leave it there? Well, because someone else might use it. But also, I think there was a kind of implicit recognition that the press was doing things that they didn't want done. Another example of that was a story from Buenos Aires, where anarchists of the city, this was in the early 20th century, they had been opponents of a very unpopular police chief. But the police chief was actually popular with the bourgeoisie and the ruling class because he ruthlessly put down strikes. So when a group of people that were described in the paper as a well-dressed mob descended on the headquarters of the Anarchist Journal, they went in, got the press, drug it out into the street, set it on fire, and danced around it like it was a witch. I mean, now that's a lot of trouble to go to. If it's just like, they didn't do that to the paper, the pencils, the chairs, the tables. It's not just the thing. It's something more scary to them. And that to me is fascinating. That says there's these presses, they were doing things. And we need to notice that politically because it mattered.
I couldn't agree more that this stuff matters and this stuff needs more excavation. And I, again, just really remind me of, doing my own research there and finding those snippets where it's almost, it's kind of breaking the accepted sort of communication style. And they often in Spain, they'll complain about the printers they've sent their work to about how rubbish they are, or your anecdote about the apology for the children's mistakes and the type reminds me of one group who were based in Cadiz in southern Spain. Very kind of Nietzschean influenced anarchism, very bombastic individualism. And they wrote this very kind of full-on letter to a much more mainstream anarchist paper, telling them all how they were kind of shills for the liberal order. But then a week later, they wrote a letter to say, "Oh, we're really sorry. There were so many spelling mistakes in that last letter we sent." It is that. It's wonderful, those moments. Do you think this is, again, something that, because you do touch upon contemporary examples, and I know your work takes you into, discussions with more recent kind of physical letterpress anarchist publishing. But one kind of comparison that I've kind of tried to grapple with a bit is between this kind of world and the world of social media, kind of horizontal organizing through mediums such as Facebook and Twitter and so on. But the world that you're describing, where the press itself is a constitutive part of the movement and this kind of community of production, do you think that that's something missing in what happens today, the way that radicals try and communicate and organize with one another, where you could claim that there is some sense of ownership of production, but not really, I would say, in our use of the media forms that we have. And this, the physicality and the labor involved isn't really there. Perhaps we have the intellectual labor going into it, but we don't have that manual side as well.
I very much suspect that could be the case. And I say suspect because that's not my world, and I don't want to speak for activists, usually younger activists, who might be able to create some equivalent to the shared physicality of printing in a digital world. I hope they do, because I think it's needed. But I remember hearing an interview recently with an activist from the Idle No More movement, the Canadian Indigenous women's movement, which was largely organized online. And she said, "I don't know if we made a movement or a brand." And I thought that was really insightful, that the shared making of things, it seems to me, is a really powerful energy in a movement. And if you don't have that, I don't know what kind of substitute you're going to find, but I worry, I fear that, like, one of the reasons I think zines, the zines are great, is that you had to get together and make them, and of course there's wonderful online zines, but I'm talking about the ones you hold in your hand. I think that digital organizers need to think about, if we're right and it wasn't just a means to an end making a journal, it wasn't just we got to get our ideas out there, it was the actual doing, the physicality of the journal. And one of the reasons that I'm convinced of this is interviewing letterpress printers today, because there's been a resurgence of letterpress printing. I didn't know this when I started this research. I actually thought all the anarchist letterpress printers were dead, and that I would only find them in archives, but it turns out they're all over. And that art schools teach letterpress now, and it's made a bit of a comeback. And so finding those people and interviewing them has been fascinating, because then I can watch them and I can say, how do you think about the press, and how do you just listen to them talk about the press. And I noticed things like printers tend to know the history of their press, as though the press were not just any old tool, as though it has its own valued history. Knowing that, for example, the press that was used at Whiteway Colony in England, which was where there was an anarchist community created, and they had a school and they taught printing, and the press they used had come from London and had been used at Freedom, the journal Freedom. And before that, someone else. These, partly because they were radicals and they were poor, it wasn't like they all went out and bought new stuff. They handed it down. And they used letterpress a lot longer than the well-financed media companies did. They went to lithograph, and then other things, other more technologically intensive with less skilled labor. Well, the anarchists, the radicals couldn't do that. They couldn't afford those kinds of equipment, but they could go to the basement and find the letterpress that had been down there for 40 years. But you wouldn't believe all the number of stories I've read where people find an old letterpress in a chicken coop. And of course, it's covered with chicken shit, and they have to clean it up and take it in, and then find some type, but off they go. For the anarchists, if you were going to be part of the movement, you needed a press.
That's very true. And I've done some research into Spanish anarchists in exile and trying to keep the movement going in extremely straitened circumstances, in reduced circles. In spite of like really bitter splits as well. The need for each of these different groups to like maintain their ability to print is something that really comes across. And then, in articles that they write as well, the feeling of gratitude that they have towards, for example, in the case of Venezuela, there was this one railway worker in Spain, somebody who'd been a railway worker in the Railway Workers Union in Spain called Vicente Serra. He ended up being made steel furniture, and I think did okay in that job. He bought an A.B. Dick offset. This is like paid tribute to in numerous comrade publications. But they often say, in spite of Vicente and his machine's limitations, we're very grateful for having this opportunity to publish, because, as you say, it was like really it was the lifeblood. But you've really hit on something in like making this connection between the letters of printing world and the letters of correspondence as well, because this is also, once you get into go into archives and looking for traces left behind by anarchists, you can really see the role that correspondence played as well in maintaining the movement, or even the role that it played in divisions within the movement as well. But this constant need for an exchange of ideas. I mean, you've already spoken a little bit about this connection that you make between these different types of letters, but perhaps you could expand on it specifically in relation to letters as correspondence and also newspapers as correspondence, because it seems to me that these publications were meant to be read by other people who are also making publications, and they were meant to be a part of a constant exchange and conversation. Is that how you read that as well?
Yes, it is. A colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, Anna Torres, she's writing a wonderful book on Yiddish anarchism, and she has this great line. She says, "The letter is the sister of the journal." That's so insightful, because there was they segued back and forth into each other, the correspondence between individuals and the publication to a larger public. Emma Goldman is a good example of that, where she, those 200,000 letters that she wrote, some of them were to just one individual. But a lot of times in that letter to some individual, she would enclose a letter she'd gotten from another individual. And of course, people didn't have copy machines, so she'd send the original letter and she'd ask for it back. So she writes to Joe Ishel. She sends a letter that Max Nettlau, the famous anarchist historian, wrote to her. Joe reads Max's letter. Joe writes back to Emma talking about Max's letter. So already, Max wasn't in there, and yet he is in there. There's the group gets bigger. And then Goldman takes it a step further, where I think she kind of invented what later became the Christmas letter, where people would write one letter and send it to all their friends and relatives. Only, of course, it wasn't at Christmas. It was almost like a little tiny newsletter and it was addressed to somebody, but it was also intended for 20 or 30 other people, and they'd all get copies of it. And then the ideas that she worked out in that letter would turn up in her speeches. And then the speeches would turn up in her published essays. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of synergy in the energy between correspondence one-to-one, which is very situated, right? It's from me to you, it's from here to there, it's got a structure. To the more public audience, it's not a cut and dried distinction. It's a blurred sort of continuum of writing in relationship to others.
We've spoken about this kind of material culture and how it's kind of applied in the anarchist world. I wondered, like one aspect of your work that I found really interesting was the kind of theoretical framing that you give it, and this incorporation of the new materiality. And it was, I mean, that whole kind of world was new to me in terms of historical theory, and it's something that I sort of wish that I'd read before I did my PhD or during it, because I think it really helps to kind of encapsulate what it is that you're doing here. On a side note, I was quite disappointed actually that most of my research into the anarchist press, most of them were only available as a kind of microfiche or microfilm, and so I wasn't able to kind of touch and smell and feel them in all these kind of sensory ways that you use to pick the world of anarchist printing. I was interested by this theoretical framing, kind of new materiality, and I think our listeners would be too. So would you mind just expanding on that a little?
I think about this a lot because I'm a political theorist by trade, and I have learned a lot from the trajectory that in my line of work people tend to call old materialism, just because it came about first, and that would be Marx and Marxist related analyses of the means of production and control the means of production and so forth, and how anarchists of course built on that in different ways. And then there's this thing that's called new materialism, and that's just because it's more recent. People like I mentioned Bruno Latour and Jane Bennett as two important thinkers, but there's many more. And there's a tendency in academia, I'm sure this is not news to anybody, that people tend to stake out a territory and defend it. And that's not a very useful way to think. So I'm trying to get past what I think of as stale debates over which materialism is better and ask, what are they good for? And I think that what old materialism does for the study of anarchism, it's irreplaceable. It tells us why anarchists did what they did. They did what they did because they objected with all their passion to the exploitation of labor, to the oppression of people by various hierarchies of church and state and capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy and empire. And they wanted to create a society in which people could create themselves as individuals while governing themselves in a free community. So why they did what they did, you need the old materialism. You need really good historical analyses of the control over the means of production and the role of commodities and so forth. But to understand how they did it, I think you need the new materialism, because what the new materialism does is bring in the idea that matter itself can be lively. That from a kind of strict old materialist, my Marxist friends shake their heads at this point and say that's just commodity fetishism. But I don't think so. I think it's another angle on things. And you don't have to give up analyzing the class structure and the means of production in order to bring in an analysis of the way that things can be active, that they can act and be acted on, that they can resonate with people and with language and meaning, and in the resonance among them, it's not that one causes the other, it's that in the distributed agency among them that something new can happen. So I'm pretty bent on trying to make a contribution here in my book, to make a contribution to thinking not in terms of which materialism is better, but how do we use them?
You're definitely right that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Yeah, I think it's just a question of imaginative openness, I suppose. But in some ways, it reminds me of things that, those old materialist analyses that have approached this. I mean, even Marx approaches it, doesn't he, when he talks about how under capitalism, relations between people appear as relations between things. So that that indicates a kind of a potential. Even if it's a consequence of capital, like at least an alertness to the possibility of an active role or an autonomy of the thing, the object. Maybe Bodega as well in Murdering the Dead kind of gets close to this kind of thinking. One of the other things that really impressed us was reading your article, Kath, is the attention you pay to the actual process of printing, which is not something that I'd ever really stopped to think about myself. But it becomes clear that printing is skilled labor, it's physically demanding. And you mentioned before, the sort of patience required of somebody like Rudolf Rocker to learn that trade. Is the fact that this is like, on the one hand, essential to the anarchist movement, on the other hand, something that is skillful, that requires learning. Is there a tension there in the sense of potentially creating something akin to a labor aristocracy or a hierarchy, depending on access to that kind of skill set and knowledge?
Yes, I think that's something to look at. I think that not just in anarchism, but in general, the printers, well, I think they saw themselves as kind of a labor aristocracy, and others saw them that way. Because if you think about in the context of working class labor, the printers were kind of an elite. First, you had to be literate, and often even in what was called a job shop, even in a place where you were just hired to print whatever the boss said to print, there was still an active role of the printer. The printer had to decide what it should say. And that often meant interpreting nearly incomprehensible handwriting. And of course, it meant control over the appearance of the page, that what we now passively call layout. That's not nothing. That's a big deal. Where do the spaces go? What size of font? How close together? How dark? What do the illustrations look like? What do the little markers look like between the various blocks of type? That's part of the reading experience. It slows down or speeds up the relationship. Like, for example, Joe Ishel, the guy who I mentioned, who was known as the anarchist printer because he was so well known in fine print circles too. He was in a sense kind of a part of this labor aristocracy that got some resentment from his fellow anarchists. There were people who said things like, why do you spend so much work making a small number of beautiful books when you could make a large number of plainer things and they'd reach more people? And so there were some criticisms of Ishel for a sense being an elitist in that fashion. And he always responded to that, first of all, by pointing out that he almost never took money for this. So he kind of bristled at the idea that he was not a good anarchist. But also, and here's where the correspondence that I've read comes in. Ishel and Joe Labadie in Detroit and William Morris, another good example of a printer who was an artist, they created beauty for the working class. And when they worked together on a journal and people who weren't already printers got to learn how to do some printing, it was creating beauty with the working class. Of course, they were also members of that class, not Morris, but the other two. It mattered to anarchists to have beauty in their movement. And over, I saw this in so many letters. One thing about doing archive work is when you see something over and over, you need to pay attention to it. That repetition is a sign that it's important. And you shouldn't write it off as, oh, it's hyperbole or they were just being kind. No, the dozens and dozens of people wrote to Ishel, wrote to Labadie and said, thank you so much for this beautiful work. I cherish holding it in my hand. It gives me joy. Because if you think about how are anarchists viewed in the mainstream media of the time and by the general public, and they were viewed as dirty, dangerous, bad, vicious, violent, ignorant, and to have their own beauty, their own place where the ideas, they already thought their ideas were beautiful, but nobody else thought that. And to have the ideas be not just beautiful in their content, but beautiful in their form was a kind of affirmation to a movement that was so oriented toward the written word. One historian refers to anarchists as people of the book. And so if you're so invested in the written word and you've got your own people making that in ways that command attention for the aesthetically powerful presentation, it was very validating.
I can certainly see that. I can see that world, and I like that depiction of anarchists as being people of the book. It's there's a very interesting similarity, but also a difference with my work on Spain, and not least because actually far fewer, by the sounds of it, kind of printers were directly involved in the movement in Spain, at least at this point. Danny might know better about the 1930s, but over the sort of turn of the century, actually make up relatively few of the movement. And wonder again if this kind of tension within the Spanish movement come about of this need for reading in the written word within anarchism, which I think is true in Spain, but also Spain's enormously high literacy rates at this point, and particularly amongst the working class, particularly amongst the rural workers as well. And so that gives me lots of things to think about, actually, about what does this mean then for a movement to be kind of the book, but also most widespread amongst 80% of population that can't actually read. And obviously there are ways around that, like oral kind of transmission is very important in the movement, but it does, as you say, it does stratify the movement. People respect and value those that can write and read to them. And I think it's a really important point. Another image that kind of made me think of kind of Spain at that time as well is the really rich depiction you give this figure of the tramp printer who you mentioned earlier, sort of going from town to town, sleeping rough, or sleeping in a hotel for a couple of dollars. And that really, really similar to the way that what they're called kind of itinerant preachers or wandering preachers of the time within the Spanish movement, of these poor men, poor literate, kind of well-learned men going around and spreading the message. And I've always been quite skeptical of this image, but it recurs so frequently that perhaps I shouldn't be. But I wonder if there is something, both from historians, but actually from anarchists themselves, that kind of romanticize this traveling figure of learning and of spreading the word. Is there something that chimes with anarchist theory in particular, do you think resonates here? You have the one printer quoting Rousseau, speaking about the virtues of traveling by foot. Again, I wondered if this character was, someone you wanted to speak about more.
I'm very fond of the tramp printers. They have wonderful stories. I think they were a way of being poor with style. In the US, at least, the travelingness, the motion of the tramp printer fit nicely with the organizing practices of Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, because they, were always riding the trains to find the next place where a general strike might happen, or some labor action would happen. And of course, a number of IWW, they were called boys, IWW boys, were printers. And I just read a letter from a woman named Agnes Inglis, who was the first curator of collection of radical literature at the University of Michigan. And she was an anarchist. And she talks about an IWW printer who rode the rails from where he was, somewhere out west, to her in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he had no money, he had no place to stay. You could tell he was a printer because he had lost 3 fingers, because, printing was, in the old days, a hazardous profession. And he just came to see the collection. And she talks about how at first she thought he was a little strange, and by the time they'd finished, gotten to know each other, she decided that she was the one that was a bit off, to not realize the power in that, his relationship to space, essentially, the fluid way that he moved through space. And so, tramp printers cultivated that. And there was a kind of a subculture of tramp printers. I was fascinated to learn that there were bars around the United States where if you walked in with your bag of sorts being the printer's block, plopped it down on the bar, you'd get a free drink. or perhaps even you could spend the night on the floor, provided you didn't get in the way of the customers. So there was a kind of infrastructure of facilitating the movement of the tramp printers. When tramp printers would come through town and they would be hired by some place that needed printers, usually a newspaper, they would have a book where they would sign in, and then they would sign out when they left. So when the next tramp printer came through, they know who was just there ahead of them on the road. So it was a kind of circulation of bodies through space that had a logic to it and was coherent, had communicative tissue that held it together. So maybe I romanticize it. Maybe we romanticize tramp printers. They kind of romanticize themselves. They kind of saw themselves as the bad boys of the print world. They were mostly men, but they had such a charm to them. I love the way they integrated the production of words and the movement through space. That seems to me very anarchist.
You use the term anarchist assemblages a couple of times in the article. Could you just explain what you mean by that and how printers and presses fit into that concept?
Well, I'm taking it from Deleuze and Guattari and, trying to make it a little more understandable. And the idea is that it's a way of thinking about a horizontal relationship where you have basically a series of networks that each one has a set of relations built into it that connect it to others and within itself through feedback loops, feed-forward loops, through different kinds of repetitions with a little bit of difference, and that the energies that flow through these movements, they tend to flow sideways rather than from top to bottom. So it's not a vertical imaginary, it's a horizontal imaginary. And a lot of people have said that, but understanding what it really means is something else, because you have to get down and dirty into your material to see how that works. And most of the people who write about assemblages say that. They say this requires close-up empirical work. You've got to really look, because what you're looking for, assemblages, some of the connections are thin and brittle. Some of them are rich and robust. Some of them are reciprocal, which would make them stronger than if they're just one way. Some of them are dense and others are thin. And the only way to know that is to do what my sociology friends say, which is your research has to be ass in the grass. And so that sort of, another media archaeologist says you got to look under the hood. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look under the hood of anarchism and find the ways that anarchist assemblages, where they flow more thickly, where the density and the reciprocity and the strength are coherent enough, long-lasting enough. And I find that printers are nodes in those dense moments, that a lot flows through them, and that they then connect to many other nodes that would appear to be less significant, but are really a very important, irreplaceable part of the assemblage. For example, I've gotten very interested in the people who collect the material, because anarchist writings, they don't stop when they're first, read or consumed, because people tended to save them, unless for a political reason it was dangerous, and then they'd, burn everything at night so the police wouldn't find it. But more often, they would save it. And they'd save the correspondence, and they'd save the publications. And maybe 20, 30, maybe 2 generations later, somebody finds this trunk full of letters between, Aunt Bertha and Kropotkin. And they say, wow, I didn't know Aunt Bertha was an anarchist. And they call somebody at one of the anarchist libraries. And it turns out the world is full of anarchist libraries, because lots of people are collecting. It's usually on a volunteer basis. Once in a while, it's a professional library like the University of Michigan or the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. And they'll say, I want to donate this material. And So somebody gets on a bus and goes and gets it, or nowadays probably ships it, and it becomes part of an archive. So the people who collect it, and I found that they are often women, and there's a vigorous correspondence at the Labadie collection in Michigan between the archivist, a woman named Agnes Inglis, and several other women. Bertha Johnson, who was a farm wife in Pennsylvania, Pearl Johnson Tucker, who was Bertha's sister and also the partner of Benjamin Tucker, who was a famous anarchist editor and printer in Boston. And these women have decades of correspondence where they say, wow, I found an old copy of Freedom from 1889. Do you want it for the collection? Yes, I do. Send it. And so that's not an afterthought to anarchist assemblages. That's critical. That sense that this is living history, that it matters, and that anarchists need to write their own history because otherwise their enemies will write it.
Yes, I thought it was really interesting what you say there about these nodes being irreplaceable, Kathy, because I mean, you seem like a very optimistic person from the way that you speak and the way that you write and everything. I traditionally try and end these programs on a real downbeat note. If we accept, right, that these production processes, it's not just the ideas, but the way that the ideas are produced and communicated that is constitutive of the anarchist movement. Does the fact that technology has moved on and that people don't write letters anymore, and that very few people, much fewer than before, still print, like, you know, freedom, for example, doesn't have a print version anymore. Is this inevitably damaging to the movement, do you think? I think most people would look at, say, the decline of print and say that's, you know, the decline of like anarchist print or something, and say that's a symptom of the decline of anarchism per se. But the way that, you know, the shift in focus that you suggest implies that maybe, you know, the fact that the technology moving on has itself played a role in the decline in anarchism at the level of like production of ideas, debating ideas.
I do worry about that, but I also think that there could be creative equivalents of the print or the press and the publication that might have that same capacity to generate energy out of the physicality of shared making. So a few examples, I think, in the Occupy movements, that the park itself, the creative human microphone, the way that people had to solve problems like, okay, they turned off the electricity, how are we going to generate electricity? Those have a materiality that can be comparable to the printers and presses. Or another example would be in the group Food Not Bombs, which has been around for a very long time. And I've always found them interesting and admirable, but it never occurred to me till I started doing this work to actually think about the food. The food is not just a means to an end. The food is part of what they do. Making food together helps their group be a group. I don't think it would be the same if you could just call takeout. I think that it's the food making, the food giving is a part of the political elasticity. And the last example I'll give is the protectors at Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is a mountain in Hawaii that Native Hawaiians, many of them, find sacred, and they are objecting to the building of telescopes on the mountain. And so they have essentially civil disobedience action that has gone on for many, many, many months. And one thing they do is they take what in secular, ordinary life terms is just a stretch of road, and they reorient themselves to it so that it becomes a sacred space. It becomes a space of hula, a space of chanting, a space of communication, and a space of organizing. That's a physicality. That's a shared making of something together. So I think there might be many creative ways that radical movements and anarchist related movements can and already do incorporate the material into the linguistic and the symbolic. And sort of my hope is that people will take that even more seriously, think even more about what it does for their movement to have that dimension and cultivate it even more.
That's a really interesting point, because it's kind of shifting the focus in a way from the media or the medium. We don't look for equivalents of anarchist print in Twitter, for example. We look for it in those, as you said, these communities of production again, and there where people are coming together is perhaps where we can look for signs of something building. And I also think that theme, the community of production, the new materiality, is really something that gives your work something I know me and Danny have written about, which is taking anarchism and saying this should be of interest to all sorts of people, that this isn't just a topic for people who are anarchists or are interested in anarchism, strictly speaking, but it's actually something that chimes across all different kind of historical eras and the contemporary world. And I think that's a real strength of what you're doing. I think that takes us to the end of our chat. It's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for talking to us today for the podcast. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kath. That was brilliant. Really enjoyed it.
Been a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. As ever, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook, both at ABC Danny and Jim, and get in touch via our email, abcwithdannyandjim@gmail.com. The podcast music is Stealing Orchestra, Gente de Minha Terra. The podcast logo is an adapted version of the Lett Book Club logo, and the image in this episode is a photograph of Tom Keel and Alfred March in the Freedom offices at 127 Olsen Street in 1927, which is available in the public domain. Love and solidarity. Until next time.
Senhor Secretário de Estado, faz favor de... Tem a palavra, não existe.